Before we can understand the context in which the populist revolutions and changes of the early 20th century happen, we need to do a quick review of the shifts that happen in the 19th century. The events and changes in political thought in Europe have deep repercussions in Latin America. There's an intellectual context that is really important because it affects changes in Europe, it flows into Latin America, and essentially contributes to a global shift in the thought about the role of governments and the rights of citizens. Both of these concepts are not part of the pre-Enlightenment world in which governments are essentially the tools of royal families that acquire their power both by appealing to a divine right and through wars. And the notion that citizens, first of all, the notion of citizenship is foreign, but the notions that subjects of the crown have any rights at all are also completely foreign. So this is a very important transformation that is, well, essentially going to question the obligations that subjects of the crown have to that crown. And as you can imagine, this is going to have an effect in the colonial world. The two political shifts that give rise or that sort of embody this change is both the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution. The French Revolution is going to be particularly important for the colonial world because the French Revolution will then lead to a counter-revolution led by Napoleon that deeply reorganizes the balance of power in Europe. The French Revolution first is a violent questioning of aristocratic and royal power, which has deep consequences in the Americas in terms of the revolution, the relationship between France and its colonial entities, notably Haiti. But then Napoleon's counter-revolution goes much further than just the relationship of France with its colonial entities, but alters the relationship of most of Europe with the world, because as the map that you can see here demonstrates, in 1812, a significant part of Europe was under control or at war or invaded by France. This changes both not just the balance of power, but the definition of power in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century, but then has reverberations into the Americas, because the Americas are essentially ruled by two countries in Europe, both of which are now either at war or under control of France. And so it's not a coincidence that most Latin American countries become independent of their colonial powers as those colonial powers are being challenged, invaded, and controlled by France, which these colonial powers and colonial trees and colonial entities consider to be foreign. It's not an accident, it's not a coincidence that most colonial territories become independent of Spain while Spain is under control of France. The colonial relationship is with Spain, and when the Spanish king is unseated and replaced by a French king, the colonies rebel. They don't rebel against Spain, they rebel against the French. Brazil's story is a little bit different because Portugal's relationship with France during the Napoleonic Wars was different, but every colonial American power or every colonial Latin American territory, except for what is already the United States, becomes independent of Spain or Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars. Everything changes for what is now Latin America in the early 19th century, and yet nothing changes. In the ex-Spanish colonies, political instability becomes the norm. There's experimentation with different types of government. Are Latin American countries now going to be, well, what type of a government replaces the colonial government? In fact, Mexico becomes an empire, chooses an emperor for the first 2 years of its independent status. Essentially, for the next 50 years after independence, most of the Spanish colonies are in complete disarray. Civil wars and territorial wars are the norm. The ex-Portuguese colonies are much calmer, largely because they essentially replace their relationship with the colonial king with the son of the Portuguese king. So everything stays the same, except that instead of being a colony of Portugal, Brazil is now independent with a Portuguese king. But transitions are rarely smooth, and again, we'll put Brazil in a bracket here. And the survival of marginalization, inequality, poverty in the Spanish colonies will lead to revolutions in the 20th century. And the most famous of those revolutions is probably the Mexican Revolution. If you think about Mexico's experience of the independent period as first starting as an empire, then leading to a revolving door of presidents. There were about 33 presidents in as many years in Mexico's early independent time. Then a war that makes Mexico lose Texas, and then another war with the United States in which it loses a quarter of its territory. Then followed by a European invasion because Mexico hadn't paid its European debts. The imposition of a European emperor for 4 years. And it's not until 1864 that Mexico returns to a republican status with a Mexican president, when presidential rule is finally established and maintained, but this is not a democratic presidential rule. The last 30 years of Mexico's 19th century are overshadowed by the long-term presidency of one man who stayed in power until he was unseated at the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. So here, this is the beginning. This is what comes before the Mexican Revolution, without which you cannot understand the Mexican Revolution.